Episode 11 of the Red Zone podcast coming in after just a few days off, just a tiny little break, nothing much to worry about. But as you can see, we've got some good topics coming up, some that I'm really excited to talk about, which is part of why I finally managed to get the series going. I don't think there's any reason to take it slow. Let's just get right into it. The first topic is Nick Saban, head coach of Alabama, is retiring. Chris Lowe announced this on Wednesday evening. Huge news, obviously. Not just as a college football fan, but specifically as an LSU fan. Nick Saban is the most influential coach, maybe even figure, in LSU football history. And that doesn't just speak to his time at Alabama, obviously. He's the combination of the positives that he was able to begin and the things that he was able to complete in his time at LSU, combined with the vast, seemingly unending level of anguish that he was able to inflict upon LSU fans year after year, it's hard to deny. And to see him go, it was a bit of an interesting feeling. I genuinely didn't know how to react. My first was surprise. There was certainly a bit of surprise, but also I'm excited. But I think if Nick Saban had retired 3 to 5 years ago, I would have been dancing in the streets. I would have been freaking out. And while I'm still happy, I think a couple things have really caused my change in this. And I think it's Alabama is not fallen off per se. They are still the second or third best program in college football at the moment. The only team you could say that has been undeniably stronger than them over the last several years is Georgia. And that's a pretty short time period as well. If we're going back 5-6 years plus, then it starts to get back in Alabama's favor. But the fact that they had gone from so unbelievably dominant to just one of the best teams, and the fact that Nick Saban had gone from screaming hard ass who you hated relentlessly to sort of a more mellow, willing to communicate with media outlets type of personality, I had sort of started to see it coming. With that said, I did not see this coming this year. I thought he would give it at least one more go, with potentially, if they were able to develop Milroe well, I thought he could have been a good talent at quarterback. He's not perfect, but there's talent there, and if he developed like a lot of guys do in their second year starting, he could be a really good QB. Obviously, they've got talent pretty much everywhere. The O-line talent, some of it has not panned out well, but some of it would be leaving. You could replenish some of that with 4- and 5-star guys. But I can hardly fault him. 7 national championships, 1 at LSU, 1 at Alabama, or 6 at Alabama, to be clear. Head coach of 4 different college football programs, 1 NFL team, 292 college football wins, 17-12 record in bowl games, 9-5 in the college football playoff, and arguably the most impressive yet, 7-3 in national championships. That is not to mention, I believe it is 8-0, perhaps 9-0 at Alabama in the SEC championship game. That stat is absolutely unbelievable, even given the fact that the SEC West generally has stronger teams. The teams that Bama has played for the most part in those championship games have been very, very tough. And LSU is one of the teams that's had the second or third highest winning percentage in the SEC championship game, I believe. And even we have had we've lost. Bama didn't under Saban. He created a new way of thinking for a college football fan base. A fan base where consistency was the baseline, where failure was, I don't even want to say an afterthought. It wasn't a consideration. It wasn't a possibility. So, regardless of what Alabama manages to do in terms of their replacement, I believe that it could be Dan Lanning. Well, actually, Dan Lanning went on a bit of a press tour today, denying those rumors. So, scratch Dan Lanning. I believe it could be someone like Lane Kiffin, someone like Dabo Sweeney. I'd imagine those two are the two prime candidates. They're also giving an interview to Tommy Rees. I don't believe anything will come of that. I don't think many would. They're apparently giving a look at Mike Norvell and Kalen DeBoer, who are two younger coaches who are respectively climbing it at their own programs, Washington and Florida State. But for me, I think it has to come down to Kiffin and Sweeney for their ties to the school, for their success in different time periods in different ways, but their success nonetheless at their programs. Regardless of who they hire, it's going to be a step down. And it might not be an enormous step down. We don't know yet, especially compared to the Bama of the last 2 years. But this is a big deal for Alabama. Going to be a lot of transfers, going to be a lot of difficulties in their future, and it completely changes the face of the SEC, the structural hierarchy of the SEC. And now Bama's just with the rest of us below Georgia until I see otherwise. So it's going to be tough. I have no doubt they will make a good coaching hire, but you can't get any better than the greatest of all time. He made my life absolutely miserable for the vast majority of my childhood and adolescence and into adulthood. But he was the greatest, and I don't really see how you could deny it. To talk about the less prominent college football news, and the news that I'm really going to talk about for quite a bit shorter than Saban's news piece, because frankly, this was just really not a fun game to watch. Michigan beat Washington 34-13 in the national championship game Monday. Michigan was favored by 4.5. It's a fine spread for a national championship game. Certainly nothing crazy, and expected to be much more competitive than last year's championship game, which it was. Not that says much. I had worries coming into the game, and I thought Michigan would win this. It's easy to say in hindsight, and you don't have to put any value in that, but I did think Michigan would win a close game. With that said, I definitely had worries about Michigan's ability, or Washington's ability, to move the sticks consistently. And when their running game was unable to really do anything significant, their longest rush was, I believe, 7 yards. No, it was 9 yards. Their longest rush was 9 yards by Jalen McMillan, who, for those who don't know, is a wide receiver. So that says a bit. 46 total yards and 2.3 yards per carry. So terrible night for them rushing. Not a great night for Penix. In fact, a pretty awful one. Just over 50% completion percentage, 2 interceptions, 5 yards per attempt, and only 255 yards total. You know, Michigan came out strong. 4.5 minute drive. Just consistent yardage running the ball. Huge touchdown run where Donovan Edwards was essentially untouched as he walked into the end zone. That sort of made you think that this might get ugly. It might be a disaster. And when Donovan Edwards did the same on the next drive, you certainly thought this game is going to be miserable. And although it wasn't the greatest, Washington really did strengthen up. In the second quarter, in the first quarter, after the initial first 14 points, they were able to get a field goal of their own. Or scratch that. Field goal came in between. It was 7-3, then 14-3. And at the half, they were going in the half, they were able to slow down Michigan's offense a lot better than they were in the first quarter. And they were able to notch a touchdown of their own just before the half. So it looked like their defense was tightening up, certainly. And their offense had finally gotten a touchdown on the board. Unfortunately, in the second half, first play, they throw an interception. And that didn't necessarily end it, but it certainly felt like they needed to get points and probably a touchdown as soon as they came out of the half, or else Michigan was just going to cruise. And when you gave Michigan back the ball inside of your own territory and nearly in your own red zone, it was never going to end well there. The moral of the story, beyond what the stats make fairly obvious, is that the yards were just too difficult for Washington. They couldn't run the ball at all. It's not like every play was negative, but they were getting 2 yards, 3 yards, 1 yard, 4 yards. That was their rushing game. And from an efficiency point of view, when they were behind from so early, it just made no sense to run it, and they gave up on that pretty early. Not to mention Dylan Johnson, who is an absolute Iron Man. That guy is a beast. Dylan Johnson is going to be, I won't say for sure, because running backs feel like such a crapshoot when they get to the NFL. But that guy is a monster, an Iron Man. The amount of times he just destroyed his ankle in the last month or so, just to come back out like it was casual, was really something. Because I believe he first aggravated that injury in the Pac-12 championship versus Oregon, injured it really badly against Texas in the final minute, and came back out against Michigan, who I didn't even think he would play against, re-injured it, and still came back out. So he was a warrior. He fought his ass off. Unfortunately, the Washington O-line was just completely overmatched. The D-line was getting cooked pretty badly too. And without some elite play calling, without some huge plays, it was just a bit too much for Washington, who still had an amazing season. Kalen DeBoer has had an amazing tenure. And despite the fact that Michigan does not have the highest level of blue chip talent, they are a consistent top 5 to top 10 recruiting team. And while DeBoer has sort of looked to move the needle for Washington in that regard, he still doesn't have a full roster of his players. And they still are not matching Michigan on a blue chip recruit level or an NFL draft prospect level, especially on the defense. So while I think they definitely could have kept the national championship game a bit more competitive, and maybe some of the stuff they came out with was a bit naive, I might say, it was still a great season. And Washington, if they replace Penix adequately, is in a good place for the future, even with Odunze and Penix on the outs. But yeah, just not a great national championship game. A hell of a lot better than last year, but that is nothing to hang your hat on. So LSU news, I guess if you don't count Saban as LSU news, which I think is a bit foolish because it affects LSU as much as about anything that could. But LSU hired after firing Matt House, which we will get to after this because I've got a whole tangent about Matt House and what he did and what he didn't do and some of the stats that occurred during his tenure. But we'll talk about the positives first. LSU hired Blake Baker from Missouri, the defensive coordinator. He was originally the linebackers coach at Missouri. He was the linebackers coach at LSU before that, and was the DC at Miami prior to that. Very young guy. He's 41 years old. He's got familiarity with LSU. He did very well at Missouri, took their defense from bottom of the conference towards the top. There's a lot of stuff to like here. We had to pay a big fee. That should be expected at LSU, though. At this point, people just know how much we're willing to pay. And he had just signed a contract extension with Missouri that had put his salary quite high to begin with. So if we wanted him, and it was very clear from the beginning, the rumors came out immediately, the fit made perfect sense. It was just immediately obvious that Brian Kelly was going to be looking in Blake Baker's direction, and we were able to procure him, which is a huge hire. Matt House was a linebacker coach in the NFL. We thought that his specialty would be developing linebacker talent, making elite linebackers with the 4 and 5 star guys that are regularly coming to LSU, i.e., Harold Perkins being the biggest example of this. And while Harold Perkins had a great year last year, a lot of that was just him playing as an edge rusher in a sort of hybrid position that teams had had no tape on to prepare for the first half of the season. And his unbelievable level of physical talent and his great instincts for pass rushing were able to propel him to what was an incredible season last year. And we all expected this year, as he moved into somewhat of a more traditional linebacking position, although I think a lot of us had some holdbacks about that, thought he might be able to remain in at least a minor pass rushing role. We were all very disappointed with what we saw. And Blake Baker is going to be somebody who we're going to look to develop and put Harold Perkins in a great place to succeed in his final, almost certainly, his final year at LSU. And this is someone who was a superstar in 22 or 21. In 22, or apologies, in 22 was a superstar. In 23 was still our best defensive player, I'd say by quite a bit. He was the only player on our defense that had any sort of consistency across the whole season, and regardless of where we had him, he had impact. He did not have the same impact as last year, although I'd argue it was probably impossible with the makeshift position swaps he dealt with at the beginning of the season and the overall lack of coordination and perhaps a bit of a lack of talent on the defense around him made it seemingly impossible to consistently have huge games. But he had good games, and his baseline was a lot higher than a lot of the guys around him. Now, Blake Baker, his crowning achievement, at least in my eyes in recent years in terms of linebacking talent, was his development of Damone Clark in 2021 at LSU. Damone Clark went from a guy who was sort of a one-track mind in that he was an okay run-stopping middle linebacker because he was really athletic. He was really athletic, so he'd get side to side sometimes. He'd make plays sometimes. He was nothing special. He was decent in 2019. In 2020, it was a really rough year. In 2021, he became one of the undeniable positives of another very mediocre LSU team. he was propelled into what is now a starting position on the Dallas Cowboys. He's a part of a very, very talented defense, and they love him over there. And I don't think a lot of LSU fans would have told you that prior to the 2021 season, even going back to 2019 when, as a younger player, he was able to have an impact on a national championship team. I don't think anyone expected him to be that level of a talent. Arguably could have won the Butkus Award, or arguably should have won the Butkus Award in 2021 for the absurd amount of tackles that he had. But regardless, it was an incredibly successful season for Damone Clark. The other hire that LSU made, we got Bo Davis, who is an enormous hire. While I'm happy about the Blake Baker hire, I don't think there is a human being on earth, an LSU fan on earth, that could say that this is a bad hire. Bo Davis is one of the premium D-line coaches in the country, if not the absolute best. Matt Moscona had Pete Jenkins, former LSU assistant from this year as well as years past, talking about Bo Davis, and what he said and the respect that he held for him just gave me even more confidence. He called Bo Davis the best defensive line coach on earth for defensive line fundamentals and technique. That is a lot of respect. That is very high praise for someone as accomplished as Pete Jenkins. Bo Davis has been hired by Nick Saban on 4 different occasions. So this is a guy who was hired at LSU in 2002. This is a guy who was hired at Miami in 2006. This is the guy who was hired at Alabama in 2007. A guy who was hired at Alabama in 2014. He was at Texas for the last 3 years. He's been at nothing but premium programs in every year save one after his intern stint at the Jaguars. I'll say it. This is the best defensive line coach that could have possibly been gotten by LSU, and it is a huge success and a huge boon to a team that needed any sort of positive news it could get on the D-line. Now, the bad news is he is inheriting a very barren defensive line room that leaves a lot to be desired. The room that he is returning to almost over 20 years after his first stint at LSU, he has one returning defensive lineman. That is our friend Jacobian Guillory. He has one incoming freshman transfer, Dominic McKinley. And you get a JUCO transfer as well. You get to throw in a JUCO transfer, so you get 3, kind of. You get 3 defensive tackles, kind of. DN's a little bit better. There are players there. There's some talent there. Certainly not elite. Certainly going to be something that Bo Davis is focused on turning around in the next couple years, and I have no doubt that he will do that. I've got a lot of high expectations for Bo Davis, and I believe the transition and the transformation that we're about to witness on our D-line, which even in our good years has often been a spot that's just been decent. It's just been good. It's been a bit since we've had a truly elite LSU defensive line. I don't think we're going to have to wait much on that front. In with the new, out with the old. Matt House had to go. We knew that once we finished the season, really, let's be honest. Still maybe even far before that. But I think once the season came to its conclusion, it was abundantly obvious. We got the typical Brian Kelly behavior of waiting till after the bowl, giving it some time, letting it ruminate. But it always felt inevitable when you have that level of a drop off, when you have that type of a gap in performance from one year to another, when you have that many guys regressing performance wise on a football field, when you have that many 4 and 5 star talents that are not showing that talent, there's something wrong. In 2022, LSU's defense was all right. It wasn't great. It wasn't anything to go crazy about, but it was okay. 48th in total defense, 51st in points per game allowed, 65th in rushing defense. That's the worst one, and still middle of the pack in Division One, and 41st in passing defense. Had some decent corners. A lot of your transfer guys gave you more than you expected, especially at the end of the year. None of that really held up. The 2023 defense is one of the absolute worst defenses, maybe in LSU history, but definitely in recent LSU history. You can't have this many categories in the hundreds as an LSU coach. Out of 133 programs, LSU was 111th in total defense, 115th in passing defense, 85th in rushing defense. Hey, they kept that one sort of close to last year. 105th in yards per play and yards per game, 79th in points per game allowed. The fact that we had somewhat decent red zone defense and that we forced more turnovers than you would have expected for a defense like ours actually allowed us to keep the points a bit lower than you would have expected for a defense like this, although you wouldn't have known it. And in third down defense, we were 114th and allowed 45% of third down conclusions. It was nearly a coin toss. Our third and long percentage was abysmal. It was a horrible, horrible defense. Mason Smith did not develop as we thought he would. Mekhi Wingo took a step back. Harold Perkins took a step back. Major Burns took a step back. You cannot have that many guys have clearly shown talent before not develop. You can't have that many new players show no talent. I don't think the guys that we brought in this year were unbelievable talent-wise, but I know they had a lot to offer. I know they were coming from good programs, and I know aside from Jordan Jefferson, they didn't really do much for us. So overall, there's not really any denying that with some changes that at worst put you in a slightly worse position talent-wise than you were last year. I'd say the D-line was a wash. I'd say that the linebackers were improved, and I'd say that the defensive backs were vastly regressed. So I'd say you had a slight decrease in talent, maybe even relatively even, and yet you went from being average to average / slightly above average to being one of the worst defenses in college football, which is unacceptable. And I think when you have that, I hate to make it as simple as this, but when you've got guys who just don't look like they want to be out there, and the stats say that you're in the 100 teens in almost every statistical department, and you're a coach at LSU, you're gone. That's not acceptable. There's a standard at a program like LSU. Matt House knew that when he took the job. He's probably not feeling sorry for himself either. I'm sure he's disappointed in the job he's done. But that was never going to get LSU anywhere, and they really wanted to move in a new direction as soon as they could, which was apparent. So they did. The NFL has had even more coaching shenanigans, even with Nick Saban news included now, even more shenanigans on the coaching front than college. Um, some big firings. Mike Vrabel let loose by Tennessee, Pete Carroll by the Seahawks, and Bill Belichick from the Patriots this morning. Hard to say which of those is the most shocking. I'd say Belichick was the least surprising, just because it was a trend that had really felt it had been coming in the past years. But I don't think that makes it any less shocking. Bill Belichick was someone who I would have bet my life on 5+ years ago that they would have retired as a Patriot. The story with Bill Belichick in recent years especially has been, Bill Belichick the coach versus Bill Belichick the general manager. I think whoever looks to hire him next is going to be very, very keen on making sure he's only in the head coaching role, and I think that would be a very wise decision. In the years since Tom Brady has left, been a lot of mistakes on the roster management front. They've had no weapons at the skill position. Their wide receiver talent and their wide receiver drafting has been obscenely bad. Their running back talent, for a lot of it, has been lacking. They don't draft well. They don't elevate their players. They don't play good offense. They don't have the best defense anymore. It was looking rough for Bill Belichick, and I think everybody knew that. Like I said, it's not totally surprising. But it is jarring, maybe is the word. And it's something to get used to. Certainly. Bill Belichick's 71 years old, though. He doesn't strike me as the type of guy who's going to retire here. Nick Saban obviously announced he was retiring. Pete Carroll, it's tough to know. I think that he actually may be, with the rumors that he is moving into an advisory role. That certainly makes me think that may be the path he's headed down. With Belichick, I don't know. I expect him to want to prove and to have the desire to prove that he can do it as a head coach somewhere else, especially after how poorly the last few years have gone. With Pete Carroll, I don't necessarily get that sense from him. He's someone who I've been very, very impressed with recently. Not necessarily this year in particular, but since the Russell Wilson trade, I thought the Seahawks would be one of the worst teams in the NFL. A lot of people did. Post Russell Wilson trade, the outlook for the Seahawks was miserable. Geno Smith was going to be their starter. And while I don't think you can attribute Geno Smith finding his form purely to Pete Carroll, I think a lot of work he did with himself and with other coaches and took time, and there was a lot of internal development there. He held that team together very well. I mean, just around 500 both years since then. I think a lot of people thought they would be a 3 to 5 win team in the years after. Meanwhile, they've done better than Denver has since trading for Russell Wilson. Quite a bit better. I don't understand this decision unless it truly was somewhat mutual, like the news implied. A lot of the time when you get these mutual partings, it really doesn't make sense on a mutual level. You can certainly sort of tell that they're sort of covering with that news, or there's some slight dishonesty in that regard. I don't think that's the case here. I think there's a possibility that Pete Carroll wants to to wrap it up. I mean, the only other thing that I can imagine is if they wanted if they were that hell bent on having a top level offense. But I don't necessarily know that what they were giving Pete Carroll currently was good enough for a top level offense. No, I got Metcalf. But beyond that, you've got an aging Lockett. Their wide receiver group is not great beyond him. The running back has been by committee for the past several years. Their O-line, prior to this year at least, had left a lot to be desired. So I assume the want would have been on the offensive side of the ball. But I don't know if the level of talent that the Seahawks gave Pete Carroll deserved better offensive. I'd have to look closer into the numbers. I'd have to really dive into that to interpret on a deeper level what those levels of performance meant. But, Pete Carroll's 72 years old. Pete Carroll's a year older than Bill Belichick. That's crazy to me. Never would have guessed. I think it's a combo of me being too young to remember Pete Carroll before USC, and a combination of the guy just looking great for 72 years old. But, I think that's a shame unless it was something that he truly wanted, because I think Pete Carroll is still a very good coach. Mike Vrabel was the other big name, I would say, that went on to the market. This is ridiculous. This was a very stupid move. I won't use any sort of restrictive pretense in this one. This was very dumb. The Titans are going to regret this immensely, probably by the third game next year. But who knows? Maybe it'll take 6 or a year. We'll see. Mike Vrabel was fired despite having nothing at quarterback for his entire tenure. The best quarterback he ever had was Ryan Tannehill, who was playing at a slightly above league average level at his best and a very bad level at his worst. They brought in Malik Willis and Will Levis. Malik Willis has not really done anything for them positive. Levis has had some moments. It's tough for me to know how much input Vrabel had on drafting those two guys specifically. I think Wills was maybe an ill-advised move. I think Levis could prove to be fine, and at the spot they were at made a bit more sense. Drafting them in back-to-back years, though, that it does look like you're being a little careless with your picks when you do something like that. I think it's a huge overreaction, to be totally honest. And I don't know if there's any other way to phrase it. I mean, you go 6-11 one year. You come last place in your division, but it's one of the better divisions in the NFL. They were the only team below 500. Colts and Jaguars both 9-5, and the Texans are 10-7. 10-7 without their starting quarterback for a few games. The Texans are stronger than their record, in my opinion. And the Colts were missing Jonathan Taylor for half the season. That it looks like a strong division, but in my opinion, it's even stronger when you really focus on it. Though, just regardless of what you think, one of the stronger divisions in the NFL. So, just limited by Tannehill. Their offensive development, again, was not great. But with Derrick Henry as your running back and Tannehill as your quarterback, doesn't that make sense? That you had a bit of a more run-based offense? I think some of these teams see a few of the teams that have had success hiring offensive-based coordinators. And I think in general, as a trend, that is positive and leads to more success. But I think these teams don't realize how good they've got it just because their coach isn't offensive minded, they're like, oh, let's can him the first time we have an excuse. It just feels a bit goofy to me, and Vrabel is the biggest example of that here because it goes on a gradient. With Belichick, I think it was time. And if he comes back anywhere else, he really just needs to be a head coach. With Pete Carroll, it's somewhere in between. And I think he may have been coming to an end on his own that he wanted to reach. With Mike Vrabel, though, I just don't get it. And I just think it's a really poor decision. And I'm willing to. But who knows? Maybe Will Levis is great. They get an offensive minded coach who takes them to the next level. Could be wrong. I doubt it, though. In terms of the openings, you've got the Chargers, who, in my opinion, with the stadium, with the city of Los Angeles, with Justin Herbert, have to be the prime opening, I think. It's hard for me to imagine another that people will be as excited about. And beyond that, I think at the next level below that, you've probably got, I think, the Titans, the Seahawks, and the Falcons as some semi-desirable places to go that'll probably be looking to snag one of the three guys that I mentioned, or potentially Jim Harbaugh if he leaves Michigan, which is still up in the air as he likes it at this point in the season just about every year. In my mind, if you are one of the teams looking at these coaches, and obviously this depends on what your roster's like, where your city is, what your QB is like. Do you think is going to be the guy who can develop him? Obviously, these are questions that'll need to be asked, and this answer could vary depending on the team that is looking. But for me, someone brought up this question earlier. In terms of Jim Harbaugh, Mike Vrabel, and Bill Belichick, who do you want at your franchise right now? Right now. I can tell you one thing, Belichick is last on that list for me. And if it comes with being a GM, he's last by a lot. Now, I expect him to be just a head coach in his next outing. I don't think it would be foolish to prefer Belichick if he's only a head coach. But Vrabel and Harbaugh are young, relatively. You know, those are guys that are over 10 years younger. Guys that have had, you know, relative to their situations. Mike Vrabel has not managed to win anything other than his division per se. But he's with the Titans. He's with a roster that has not had a lot of expectations outside of when Derrick Henry fever was at its peak. And he's done well there. He's done really well there. He makes smart, strategic decisions. He will not make tactical decisions that lose you the game. The players seem to have liked him. And with Jim Harbaugh, you've got someone who's got undeniable NFL success from the past, has taken his game up a notch in recent years in college football, and I've no reason to think that the things he may have learned won't translate, because it's not like he's just started recruiting 5 stars when he was only getting 3 stars in the past. I'd take both of those guys over Bill Belichick if I'm looking for a head coach right now. It's tough to say which. I think I'd probably take Harbaugh. I probably would. But I could understand Vrabel, and I could understand Belichick. I don't think there's anything wrong with either of those. But someone's got to have them. I can't imagine any of those 3 really going to anywhere other than Chargers, Titans, Seahawks, and Falcons. Those are just the only jobs on there, on the carousel currently, that look like anything, in my opinion. The it pains me to say this because I just know that I am jinxing them once again. But the Pelicans are good. Pelicans are really, really good. Right now, the New Orleans Pelicans are 23-15, first in our division, tied for sixth in the conference. We're tied with fourth and fifth, though. The Pelicans are top 6 in the league in net rating. They've won 6 of their last 7. They are absolutely slaughtering teams lately, including a 141-105 win at Golden State, a 133-100 win at Sacramento, an 11-point win at number 1 seed Minnesota. And actually, it doesn't stop here, because you've then got you have a 27-point win over Brooklyn and a 20-point win over the Lakers. If you take out a few last-second chokes, this team could have 1 or 2 losses over the last month. And when you really come down to it, the only thing preventing this team from being the 1 seed, from being one of the best teams in the NBA, undeniably, I already think they are one of the best teams in the NBA, is what are they going to do about those late game struggles? And in the past, we haven't had those issues lately, but part of me thinks the reason we haven't had those issues lately is because we've just been killing teams so badly that it's not a concern. We're just able to blow teams out, and we don't have to worry about playing close games. And I love that. I think it's great. I really like beating teams by a lot of points. But at some point, when you get to the playoffs, that's not viable anymore. You've got to be able to figure out, okay, what are we doing in crunch time? Who are we going to? What are we drawing up? What do we not do? I've got to hold out hope that Willie Green has been working on that and is getting on top of that, and we're going to see a team that, when we start getting back into those close games, because they will come, we just got to hope it's a team that they can cope with those situations. Because when you're losing 6 games that you've led by double digits in the last 5 minutes, that's inexcusable. And I think what's crazy to believe is I think 2 weeks ago, Willie Green's seat was genuinely starting to heat up, and right now he might have the best team in the NBA. That's just how these things swing, right? But they have all the talent in the world. I mean, you've got a different guy scoring the most points every night. Just in the last 2 weeks, we've had Trey Murphy, Zion, Brandon Ingram, McCollum, and Valanciunas all lead the team in points. We don't have a player averaging more than 22 points per game. We don't have a player averaging more than 5 assists per game. Everyone seemingly gets like 4 to 6 assists per night. We're playing great team basketball. We're playing really, really good defense. Incredibly good defense. And our offense is figuring it out at an elite level. This team, and I'm crossing my fingers. Can't tell me I'm not crossing my fingers, because I want to say this, because I am allowed to be excited about this team. For once, I can be excited about this team. If they don't get any injuries, this team could go deep in the playoffs. I don't know if they could get out of the West, but this is the type team that could make a Western Conference Finals run, in my opinion. The talent's been there. Just got to come together at the right time. They've just got to be able to stay healthy for a good stretch. And at the moment, it really feels like both of those requirements that at times felt like pipe dreams have become a reality in the short term. And they're just 3.5 games back on first place in the West, despite currently being in sixth place, because the West is an absolute gauntlet once again, and it's incredibly tight. But we just got to keep pushing. We've been gnawing away at that lead, making it smaller and smaller, and I think the Pelicans are on track to be one of the best teams in the West for the rest of the season. Big game on Friday night versus Denver. I know I will be watching that at 9 p.m. Central. Thankfully, it's a Friday, though. That is going to wrap it up for this week's episode of the Red Zone. If you've got anything that you want to talk about, any ideas for topics, any questions, I will be trying to implement a short amount of time to answer those questions or talk about any topics that are particularly desired in the future. Always something I wanted to get to, but in previous episodes, for whatever reason, mostly just me forgetting, I had not managed to. But as I said, please leave a like, leave a comment if you enjoyed the episode. Really appreciate everybody who did watch. Hope you come back for next time. Back in a week.